Hey Bookaholics, and welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you history through fantasy. I recently did a video where I was recommending books that are either Regency fantasy or Victorian fantasy. I've done a lot of videos talking about the history within books and the way it's represented, especially during those two periods, because those are periods of interest to me. Then in that video, I said, I'm happy to recommend other periods in history if people would be interested. And it seems like a lot of people were somewhat interested. So I'm going to be doing that today. I'm going to be going through various periods in history that we have seen in fantasy works, be it in high fantasy as a clear inspiration or as ones where it is set in our world and it's a low fantasy. So we're going to be going through those today. I'm going to be talking through my thoughts and recommendations and how well it depicts the time period, in my opinion. Bear in mind that most people who are history nerds are not history nerds for every period in history. So for me, it's early to mid-modern is kind of my interest. So we're talking Tudors through to Victoria is kind of my niche. Everyone has their own somewhat interests in history. I'm sure that there will be people that will have a better idea on these than I do, but I'm going to do my best. Now, full disclaimer, the most important disclaimer I can say about this video before I get started is I'm going to be putting on this particular list books that are either European or with a specific focus on England. A, because that's the history that I know, but B, because periods in history vary wildly from one continent, one country to another. Where we're at in terms of technology, and no, not because Europe is ahead. For example, brain surgery, our earliest known archaeological findings of brain surgery is in South America. Great deal of early literature and writing are in North Africa and West Asia. For example, mathematics, we're talking Asia. I'm not saying that Europe is more advanced. I am saying that different civilizations advance different things at different times. So it's very hard to consolidate one time period. So what I'm going to do is, because Europe generally was progressing at a similar rate, I'm going to be doing a special focus on Europe and England because those are the ones I can give you more detail on that time period. It would be disingenuous for me to say to you, oh, this was happening during this time period in a country that I don't know the history of. So I'm going to do a separate video where I am going to recommend non-European or non-European centric fantasy history, but I will be able to go into less detail because I don't know enough about it. Not for any other reason. It's not because of disinterest. It's simply not something that I have learned yet. And it is something that I am interested in, and it is things that I'm reading up about, but it is something I've been exposed a lot less to. And I think that coming from own voices and people who have a much wider knowledge of that makes more sense. So I'm literally going to only be able to give you recommendations for books that I have enjoyed. I won't be able to speak as to the accuracy or as to how well it captures the time period because I don't know. So a non-European centric recommendations list for historical fantasy is coming. For now, this one is going to be Europe with a special focus on England. I hope that that's okay. I just thought it would be more honest of me if I separated places that I know about versus the places that I know nothing about, because I can't say with any level of confidence how authentic the depictions are in places I don't know the same amount of history on. Very sorry for the long ramble, but I didn't want to seem like I'm specifically excluding the rest of the world out of disinterest or out of disrespect. Quite the opposite, out of respect, and me not wanting to conform the rest of the world to European timelines and European eras. Like the way we define historical periods is very different all over the world, and I thought it would be less respectful if I tried to shoehorn other cultures into that. Let's get into the recommendations. We're going to start with the largest portion of history and the one I have least recommendations for. We have prehistory. In prehistory, we have the known ones. We have the Paleolithic, which is from the first humans, which according to archaeologists at the moment is dated to about 2.8 million years ago. Obviously, it could be much further back. It's just what we've found so far archaeologically. I only have one recommendation in here, and that is The Clan of the Cave Bear by Gina Mowell. This is not a book that I loved. It is one that is definitely a product of its time. This book was written, I think, in the 80s, and it shows. So it's not one that I loved. And also it very, very much depicts, especially Neanderthals, in the wrong way. It makes up up stuff. It's very much a fantasy in that sense. It's not actually a fantasy, there's not really any magic in it, but it's a fantasy because of how much it misrepresents history. This is the story of a Homo sapien girl who is being raised by Neanderthals, and the way that they perceive her as ugly and hideous and terrifying because she looks so different. She has the blonde hair and blue eyes and Homo sapien bone structure. But it depicts Neanderthals in a really odd way. For example, it shows them with the inability to cry, which is interesting because, you know, if you're going through evolutionism, you know, us being like descended from apes, etc., it's like, well, there isn't a single monkey out there that can't cry. Like, at least I'm sure there's an individual monkey maybe that doesn't have tear ducts, but in the sense of like all species of monkeys can cry. So it's just an odd thing to have decided to depict, and it's wildly inaccurate as well. But it's the only one that I have that actually depicts this time period of this far back. So if you have any recommendations for a good old Paleolithic recommendation, I would be curious. Then we go into the Neolithic. The Neolithic has 3 sub-periods. That is the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. Did I say those backwards? I think I said those backwards. I think it's Iron Age then Bronze Age. My bad. Prehistory, really not my thing. I don't know very much. I'm sorry. I have 2 recommendations in this time period in particular, both of which are from the Bronze Age, which is the latter part of the Neolithic, which are The Reindeer People by Megan Lindham, which is a pen name for Robin Hobb. This one is depicting clan-like style behavior, but we are very much now well into Homo sapien territory. So by this point in history, we are dealing with Homo sapiens. We are not seeing any other of the other subspecies of humans. We're not seeing any of those. We're literally just we are at Homo sapiens now, so we are talking about our direct ancestors. The other one that I have, which is not set in our world but is inspired by our world, is the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. Neither of these again are series that I am particularly besotted with, but they are ones that I think do a really good job of depicting the time period and depicting the way of life. And I think it's quite interesting what they decide to play with, whether it's deciding to play with gender roles, or whether it's deciding to play with clan behavior, or whether it's deciding to tackle community in some way, shape, or form. I think that they were both handled interesting conversations about the time period, and they did a decent enough job depicting what we've been able to glean archaeologically. Now, when we're talking about a period this far back in history, it's very difficult to get accurate representations of what we think life might be like. We can get a vague idea based on findings archaeologically, but it's very difficult to be very precise because we're talking about very small amount of what's left to be able to be uncovered. So fascinating time period, but not one that we have a huge amount of answers on. So I think based on what we've seen archaeologically, these books really breathe life into a time period that we don't know a huge amount about. Now we're going to start getting into the transition between prehistory and history. We're going to talk about the classical or ancient age. In Europe, we mostly focus on the Greco-Roman period. Like the classical age is very much Greece and Rome, what we normally associate with it. North Egypt as well. And we start to see also some of the Germanic tribes. So this is before the Vikings, but we are starting to see Germanic tribes up in especially the north of Europe. This is where a lot of our mythology is set. Whether or not it's actually depicting that accurately, it is a completely different thing. But we see, for example, Madeline Miller's both Circe and Song of Achilles would be based on this time period loosely, because they are based on the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Iliad being the War of Troy, which does have at least some archaeological foundation. It is believed that that was a conflict that happened. The myth and the history kind of converge here. It's one of those where, for example, any of the Boudica inspired ones are the same. How much we know about the real Boudica is quite limited to just a couple of Roman historians. But we do have a time period in which we know that, for example, revolutions and revolts against the Romans was happening. So there is enough archaeological foundation for at least the event, if not the people. We also have anything by Natalie Haynes, which follows the same criteria. I have also Medea. There's I, Medusa as well. And then for a fantasy that is inspired by this time period is we have the Nevernight series by J. Christoph. This one is actually more inspired by the Byzantine period. So we're transitioning from the ancient age into the early medieval age. It's a transitional period, the Byzantine Empire. Then I believe, but I haven't read, but I believe that the new James Arlington series is also inspired by the Roman Empire. So we've got a few going on here in terms of inspiration. It's a very difficult one because people get obsessed with the Roman Empire. I'm much more interested in the Republic. And I think people think they are the same. But obviously it spans such a huge amount of time. It's really easy to be like, oh, this is inspired by the Romans. And it could be anywhere in like a 700-year period. So it gives you a lot to play with. So it's very easy to be inspired by and very difficult to get wrong because you can just pick and choose bits of it, really. Be it aesthetics or politics or the social structure and hierarchy, or even if it's just gladiatorial games. It's one that's difficult to get wrong. And now we're going early medieval period, which goes from the fall of Rome in about 500 AD through to the year 1000 AD, more or less. So this was like only a 500-year period, which sounds like a lot, but when we're talking about the previous ones, we're definitely splicing time up a lot more now. This is a time period where kind of colloquially known as the Dark Ages. With the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the information and knowledge, and a lot of the things that we learned, human bodies, about economy, about architecture, about civilization, got lost. So what remained of Rome, they fled to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Don't start singing it. We have a lot less information. We have high numbers of illiteracy. And this is where Christianity is. You don't need to learn to read. We'll just have our priests read to you so that we can control the narrative. It's a very heavily religiously controlled time period. And it's also a very, very, very war-hungry period. Don't get me wrong. Every period is pretty war hungry, but this time period, it is a little bit of a survival of the fittest type of time period. We're in small groupings, we're not in big cities. This is where we start to see the rise of the Vikings. So for this time period, recommendations that I have are, for one that is inspired by this time period, the obvious one for me is the Banished Land series by John Gwynne. I'm fairly certain that his other series is as well, but I've not read it. But the Banished Land series is very much inspired by this time period, most notably in like Celtic and Anglican Britain, I think is what it's inspired by. And then other ones that are in Britain that we have, Lucy Holland's books, both of her books are inspired by this time period. We've got history and mythology woven into those as well. We have Song by Shauna Lawless, which I've only just recently read and is also very much inspired by this time period, by the latter end of this time period with the Viking invasion into Ireland. The Buried Giant, which is post-Arthurian, so Arthur being supposedly during the latter end of the Roman Empire, and then this one is when we're starting to see the different factions of England all kind of disagreeing with each other, and that's a very tumultuous time period for England, and yeah, we're seeing that very much in The Buried Giant. And one that I've not read but that I believe is set during this time period and has been recommended by my friend Rebecca over on my Discord is all of Juliette Marillier's books. These are all inspired by, I believe, early medieval Ireland, but again, not read them. Now we're going to go into the late medieval. Late medieval, and as I said, the modern era, those are my comfort zones. Those are the ones I could ramble on for ages about. So the time period for the late medieval is from the discovery of America. I don't like calling it the discovery of America. The colonizing of America would be a more accurate term. And also the fall of Constantinople. So now Constantinople is in the hands of the Ottomans. For ones that are inspired by this time period, obvious one is A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire is very, very, very much a one-to-one depiction of the War of the Roses, which happened during the 15th century, and it's a civil war that happened due to a war of inheritance. Game of Thrones is literally inspired by that. If you want to know the history of the War of the Roses, Game of Thrones does a very good job of depicting that. It's very accurate. Other ones that are clearly inspired by this time period, we have The Empire of Dust by Anna Smith Spark, and pretty much anything that is written by Anna Smith Spark. We've got the Godblind series by Anna Stevens, The Devils by Joe Abercrombie, and Angel Mage by Garth Nix. Now, the latter two, The Devils and Angel Mage, are clearly showing the religious conflicts that are happening in Europe during this time period. We're starting to see the rise in Protestantism and people veering away from Catholicism. We're also seeing the rise in different orthodoxies. So we're seeing a lot of Christian turmoil, because we're all still Christian, but we're veering away from the papacy because these states are wanting to garner more power for themselves and don't want to have to listen to the Pope in Rome. Especially as we're starting to see more and more corruption within the papacy, we're like, well, we don't want to be ruled by you because we know who you're going to favor. So we've got a lot of that going on as well. Ones that are historical fantasy that are set in our world that are inspired by this time period, we have the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. This is set in the 14th century, I believe, in Russia, and we are following the Christianization of Russia, especially as we are trying to stomp out the remaining bits of paganism, with the church feeling a little bit tense, everyone feeling a little bit on edge about the way the church is going, the rising in all of these other types of faith. We're very much anti-paganism at this point. It's very much we're going to start burning heretics kind of territory. And this is definitely where we start to see a rise in the religious tensions again. So you see, for example, in the 1500s, we see the likes of Mary I and Elizabeth I, who are Catholic and Protestant respectively, and they're starting to burn people from the opposing faith. So we're seeing a heck of a lot of religious conflict here, which is the epicenter of the Winter Night trilogy. We also have a similar situation happening in The Bird King. The Bird King by G. Willow Wilson is set in southern Spain during the fall of the Moorish Empire in Al-Andalus, in Andalusia, which is where I am currently. And we're seeing the conquest of southern Spain and therefore the Christianization of the final foothold of the Islamic world in Europe. So again, religious conflict happening there. So therefore that is also set in the 1400s. And the last one that we have is one that is on the cusp between late and early medieval, and that is Banners of Blood. Banners of Blood is following the reign of Edward III. Edward III being the king that believed that he was the king of France as well, and what started the 100 Years' War. This one also has a lot of religious iconography, which makes sense for the time period. Again, religious iconography during the medieval period is incredibly important. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that take place in Banners of Blood because it is kind of a divine conflict as well between heaven and hell. And now we're going to move into the modern period. Now, the modern period is a little bit more difficult to define because there are certain periods that kind of overlap both medieval and modern, so it's a bit more difficult to discuss. But yes, obviously this one starting with the end of the medieval period, which again, as I said, is with the colonizing of America, and this goes all the way through until World War II. I've divided this into different subcategories. These will overlap. This isn't like a linear thing because it depends on what the focus of the book is. You'll see when I get to it. So the first one we have is the Renaissance. Renaissance is our interest, or our revived interest in especially classical history. So we've gone back to being really, really in love with the Greeks and the Romans. Yes, it's not new for you to be in your Roman era phase because we've been doing that for a while now. A couple of fantasies that are inspired by this, high fantasies. We have both the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and we also have the Rock and Rose series by M.A. Carrick. Now, those are very different vibes, but both of them are in their era of idolizing the past. So you start to see an awful lot of emerging of pagan and Greco-Roman iconography. There's a lot of inspired by ancient Greece, but Jesus going on in the arts, and therefore this admiration for the past. One that is set during this time period is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I've not read it, but I know that it's set during this time period because it's set in the, I believe, late 1500s. High religious iconography with reverence to the past. During the modern period, probably the most exciting section that you can talk about is the Age of Piracy. The Golden Age of Piracy being between the 1650s and the 1730s. Most pirates were actually sanctioned by their crowns. I'm going to point that out. Most of them were not what you see in movies. They were very much sanctioned by their crowns, and it was a way of waging war without waging war. I don't have any actual historical fantasies that are set during this time period, but I do have two high fantasies that are very clearly inspired by this time period. We have the Live Ship Traders series by Robin Hobb, and we also have the Tide Child series by R.J. Barker. Now, I would say Live Ships is more late 1600s, and I would say R.J. Barker is more early 1700s in terms of where we're getting the inspirations from, especially when we're talking about a empire, when we're talking about the way that ships are run, and when we're talking about the purpose of the piracy itself. The next one that I'm going to talk about is the Age of Enlightenment. This is when we start embracing science. This is when we start really being interested in the sciences. This is when we stop condemning Galileo, for example. It's when we start embracing that science can actually discover things. When sciences start getting funding as well. So for example, in the mid to late 1700s, we have George III putting huge amounts of funding into the sciences, especially astronomy, but just general investment in the sciences. We're starting to see an increase in the studies in medicine, although that doesn't really take off to the level that would be preferable until the Victorian era. We start seeing the early foundations of it in as early as the 16th and 17th century. So this is where a lot of those light academias would come in, Lady Trent style. I mean, Lady Trent is inspired more by the Victorian era, which again, we're talking about the Age of Enlightenment just keeps going. It just spans, you know, we're talking about once the sciences take off. So we're talking from the 16th century all the way through to the Victorian era, where we're seeing Darwinism become a thing, where we're seeing heliocentrism becoming sanctioned by the church. So lots of things happening. We've always been creating, we've always been interested in the sciences. Just the way that the sciences are depicted varies a lot from one to another in terms of the time period that we're talking about. But Lady Trent is a great example of this. Another great example of this is the Rainwild Chronicles by Robin Hobb. This one, again, depicting the love of education and learning that we see a lot in the Enlightenment period. The next period that we have is America's favorite revolutions. And we have a few that are like clearly inspired by revolutions. And then we also have ones that are depicting an actual revolution. The ones that are inspired by it, we have Witch Wife, which is potentially more inspired by the American Revolution, so I was hesitant to put it on here, but we see an awful lot of depictions of what look very much like Britain, because obviously the War of Independence is both Britain and America. I didn't really know where to put it, especially with the heavy involvement of France as well. So it's a very difficult one to kind of square where we're depicting this. So I'll put this one in here, and then in the non-European one, I'll put some other American Revolution inspired ones. But I really liked the way that it depicted colonial Britain, because we're in Britain for a decent chunk in the fictional Britain, and I think that it was depicted really well, and it highlighted a lot of the mindsets and behaviors that we see during this time period that I really did appreciate. A lot of these you will also see in my Regency section of recommendations for my Regency versus Victorian video. So this is an era where a lot of those recommendations would be applicable. It's where we're also seeing the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. So we have Guns of the Dawn, for example, by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is very much a French Revolution inspired fantasy. We're also seeing the Red Winter, which is a low fantasy that is inspired by the French Revolution. And then the last of the revolutions that we have is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution encompasses a lot. We have the beginnings of the uses of steam power and how that revolutionizes our economy. And then within that, you start to have things like protests for workers' rights, etc. And it spans a century of these indignities towards humans and therefore the way that we combated that. Some of the depictions of this that we would see is, for example, in Age of Madness, they do a really good job of that, discussing the way that revolutions work and don't work at the same time, and the way that people in power always manage to keep that power regardless, and that they just need a scapegoat. So I think that Age of Madness by Joe Abercrombie does a really good job of that. Miss Bond Era 2 is clearly set during the Industrial Revolution. I don't think it's discussing revolutions particularly, but it's set during that time period. And then the last one I have to talk about is Outlander. This is not one that I've read, but it was recommended by my friend Jade over on my Discord, so I will leave my Discord linked if you want to sort of see the conversations that amounted to this video. Have the Jacobite Rebellion. Also, I believe, see the American Revolution, but again, not relevant to this video. We have the Jacobite Rebellion, which again is a religious conflict of sorts, but not really. It's more like a power grab, and it's also a little bit of disenfranchisement, especially of Scotland. But it's very tumultuous and very complicated, and there were lots of avenues to it. And I think that Outlander does a good job of simplifying it. Maybe simplifies it a little bit too much from what I saw of the show, but again, important conversations to be had about the way that especially England treated its surrounding nations that it had colonized. The next one we're going to talk about is imperialism. It's known as the Belle Epoque, which is literally the height of colonialism. It is when we have colonized half the globe, where you've got about 4 powers that are competing for the whole globe. Mostly England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Empire are all just at it for the globe. We're colonizing everywhere. I have 3 recommendations for this. They're all set in our world, so they're not quite the epic fantasies, but they are depicting these eras in an interesting way. The first one we have is Temeraire by Naomi Novik. This one is set during the Regency era. It is set during the Napoleonic Wars, so you could also apply that to the previous video. But this one, it is very much depicting the way that England and France were at war with each other, and the way that they literally took that conflict to the whole globe. We had a fight with each other and we made it everyone else's problem. Basically. And it does such a good job of depicting the time period. It depicts some of the battles in such a wonderful way, especially now that we've got dragons in here, and the way that it depicts the dragons as being very akin to what we see in World War I Air Force. That comparison was so good. They are not perfect books. There are definitely books in there that it does. But if you want a really good taste of what that time period looked like and felt like, and a lot of the politics that were going on during that time period, would highly recommend. We have the Last Binding series by Freya Marske. This one is Edwardian story. So, this is where we're starting to see cars, where we are starting to see a really industrialized England. We're seeing the decline in the aristocracy, because one of the things the aristocracy didn't predict when it came to imperialism is that imperialism gives people land and money outside of our tiny little island, which means that more people can make money, and more people making money means that then this forced hierarchy of aristocrats above all starts to deplete. So I think that depicts a really good job of the decline in the aristocracy through financial means, and the way that politics was shifting and who gets a seat in Parliament. And then the last one I have to talk about for this section is Midnight in Everwood by M.A. Kuznia. This one, it's not really depicting the Belle Epoque in terms of the colonial side so much as it's depicting the distractions that we're talking about this time period. So we want the upper classes to very much still be feeling like things haven't changed. Everything is dandy, everything is beautiful, right? We don't want rich ladies worrying themselves about things that are happening elsewhere. So it shows a really good job of how we upheld the visage of classism, and I think it does a really good job of that. Don't worry, we've only got 2 more periods to go. The first one is the Witches era. Now again, the Witches era does actually encompass more than just the modern era. It starts in about the 1450s is when we start seeing the witch panic, and it continues all the way through to the 1750s, because again, religion, it does its thing. So as I mentioned, in the 1450s, it is where we're really starting to tighten our grip on Christianity. The Catholic Church especially is getting really, really panicky about these changes in religion and the way that these religions are popping up. And then these religions in turn need to almost prove that they are a real religion, that they are stemming from real beliefs, that their interpretation of the Bible is just as valid as that of the Catholic Church. So everyone now needs a scapegoat. Everyone needs a villain. And we're going for Protestants, and including witches. Witches were just women that could do math and knew herbs. We needed a scapegoat, and witches were the obvious one. And then it became a tool to use to control women. And it was a really long period of trying to make sure that you scared women into conforming. You didn't want to look too odd because you could get condemned as a witch. I only have 2 recommendations for this that I know are set in our world that I've liked, because I do, for example, have The Burnings by Naomi Kelsey. And while I do think that it discusses witch trials in an interesting way, I had problems with the way it depicted real life women, and therefore I don't feel comfortable recommending it. I do have a vlog where I talk about it. I'll leave that link somewhere in case you want my thoughts on it, but it is one that I struggled with. However, one that I did really like, that I think do a really good job of depicting it, is that we have the Louisa Morgan series. Not all of these are set in the UK or in Europe. I think only 2 of them are set in Europe. The rest of them are set in America. But these are a very good example of the kind of women that would be deemed witches. The first one especially tackles a woman who is accused of being a witch, and she's actually Roma, and it's more about herbs and maybe charms. But that was a really fascinating one. And then we also have Hex, which is a novella that I really loved by Jenny Fagan, and this one is depicting the final moments of Ailís Duncan, who is one of the women who was accused in the North Berwick witch trials. And then the very last period that we have is World Wars and everything in between. We have Great Depression in between. We have the World Wars. So starting in 1914 with the start of World War One and ending in 1945 with the end of World War Two. All of these, again, are ones that are very much just set in our world. None of these are high fantasy. So the first one that we have is The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. This is following World War One, and I believe it does show a great deal of the horrors that not only the soldiers but also the women who were there as nurses and carers were experiencing during this time period. The amount of PTSD that came out of World War One, the amount of horrors that we're seeing, because it's trench warfare, and trench warfare is horrifying. Then we see Narnia, of course, The Chronicles of Narnia. Again, not one that I would necessarily recommend nowadays. I mean, it's not even one that I'd recommend you reread, but in terms of nostalgia, it's there and the films are fun. This is obviously depicting World War II as well, so we are seeing the children being displaced. That was something that was also very common, is that we were displacing families, especially getting them away from London. As someone who is from Coventry, we saw a lot of displacement from Coventry as well, because Coventry was one of the places that we were building the Spitfires. It was one of the primary places for building most of the Spitfires, but also a lot of the cars as well, because it's a manufacturing town. Again, a lot of bombing happening in Coventry. We only have a tiny chunk of our cathedral left. So again, like, a lot of families being displaced from there. My nan got displaced for a brief period of time because of it. The bombings were definitely something that we were seeing in Narnia, and it's a reason for why they go to stay with Professor Diggory to begin with. Then we also have Deathless by Catherine M. Valente. This one kind of deals with a little bit of Russian folklore coupled with the horrors that we see in World War II, and I think that was handled in a really interesting way. We have When Women Were Dragons, which isn't actually set during World War II and therefore should technically be more in contemporary history, but it's the ramifications of World War II that I'm interested in for that story, in terms of the way that we see that women's heavy involvement during both World War One and World War II so easily discarded in favour of the men. Upon a Frosted Star by M.A. Kuznia, which is also showing the ramifications of World War One, the Great Depression, and the financial instability that comes from that. And we also have The Scholar and the Last Fairy Door by H.G. Parry, which is showing research, I suppose, that went into dealing with ailments post World War One. It shows it in a fantastical way. In this case, we're dealing with fairy curses that happened in World War One, but we did suddenly start investing a load of money into medical research post World War One because we had so many injured soldiers, which I think is depicted in a good fantasy parallel that we see in The Scholar and the Last Fairy Door. So those are all of my recommendations for historical fantasy or fantasy inspired by history. Let me know if you think I've left any out that are, again, Eurocentric specifically. And yeah, let me know what your thoughts on any of these are. I would love to know. I hope that this has kind of given you a little bit of an idea of which books I think do a good job of depicting history, even if they are fantasy or even if they are not necessarily accurate to history, which ones are good at capturing the right vibes, etc. But yeah, that is all from me for today. So thank you ever so much for watching, and I will hopefully catch you in another one soon.